You think you know the God of the Bible? Let me take you back to the Old Testament, where the picture of God is far from what you might expect. This is not the God of soft-spoken love and forgiveness you hear about in Sunday school. No, this is a God who orders massacres. Yes, you heard that right. Let's start with one of the most shocking stories, the conquest of Canaan. In Joshua 6 verse 21, Yahweh commands Joshua to wipe out an entire city, men, women, children, even the animals. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, imagine this scene for a second. Thousands of innocent lives slaughtered at the command of the God who created them. Is this divine justice? Or are we looking at something far more terrifying? The Bible is full of these stories. In 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, God orders Saul to go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We're talking about total annihilation, God-sanctioned genocide. The Gnostics, an early Christian group, believed that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, wasn't the true God. They saw him as a lesser flawed being called the demiurge, a tyrannical ruler obsessed with control, destruction, and punishment. According to them, Yahweh wasn't the creator of the universe. He was just the creator of this broken, corrupt world. The true God, in their view, was beyond the material universe, a being of pure goodness, untainted by the violent tendencies of Yahweh. But think about this for a second. If Yahweh is this demiurge, it would explain a lot. Why else would a God of supposed love and mercy order the slaughter of innocents, including children? Is this the action of a loving creator, or of a tyrant protecting his power? Yahweh's rule in the Old Testament is filled with fear, fire, and blood, and that's hard to reconcile with the image of Jesus in the New Testament. So, what do we do with this? Are we talking about two entirely different gods? One who commands genocide, and another who teaches us to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, in Matthew 5 verse 44. This stark contrast isn't just a theological hiccup. It's a glaring divide between the nature of Yahweh and the God that Jesus presents. The Old Testament God acts like a warlord, while the New Testament God is a healer, a peacemaker. That's a serious disconnect. It's a consistent theme throughout the Old Testament: punishment, vengeance, and a relentless demand for obedience. You step out of line and Yahweh's wrath falls like a hammer. The flood in Genesis, where God drowns every living thing on earth except for Noah's family and the animals on the ark, is another perfect example. It's a global massacre. Yahweh's solution to a corrupt world is to destroy it. Compare that to Jesus, who heals the sick, forgives the sinner, and speaks of peace. It's almost as if Jesus is trying to repair the damage done by Yahweh, to undo the carnage that came before him. So, you've seen the Old Testament God in action: fire, fury, and commands for destruction. But now we move to the New Testament, where things seem different. Or do they? Jesus comes onto the scene, and suddenly it's all about love. His preaching, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, in Matthew 5 verse 44. And it feels like a 180-degree turn from the God we just looked at, right? But before we get too comfortable with this new image of a kinder, gentler God, let's take a closer look. Jesus doesn't come to abolish the Old Testament law. He makes it clear in Matthew 5 verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, what does that mean, fulfill them? Is Jesus just the next step in Yahweh's plan, an updated, softer approach to the same old rulebook? Or is something else going on here? If you think about it, there's still judgment in the New Testament. The stakes are still high. Jesus talks about heaven, but he also talks about hell, an eternal punishment for those who don't follow the path. You disobey. And it's not Yahweh's sword you're facing anymore, it's eternal damnation. So is this new God of love really all that different? Or is he just offering a different kind of punishment? Sure, the tone is softer. Instead of commanding armies, Jesus is healing the sick and forgiving sinners. But when you read passages like Matthew 25 verse 41, where Jesus warns about the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, it's clear that the consequences are still just as harsh. And it makes you wonder, is this love, or just a new strategy to enforce obedience? Gnostics had an interesting take on this. They didn't see Jesus as the son of Yahweh, the violent Old Testament God. Instead, they saw him as a messenger from a higher, true God, an entirely different divine being who came to rescue humanity from the grip of Yahweh, the demiurge. In their view, Jesus wasn't fulfilling Yahweh's law, he was trying to free us from it. If Jesus is a liberator from the harsh rule of the demiurge, then suddenly the New Testament isn't about continuing the Old Covenant, it's about breaking it. The Gnostics argued that Jesus came to reveal the truth about the flawed creator of this material world, offering us a way out of the suffering and chaos that Yahweh had imposed. But here's where it gets tricky. Mainstream Christianity teaches that Jesus and Yahweh are one and the same, Father and Son united in the Holy Trinity. Yet how do you reconcile the actions of the vengeful God in the Old Testament with the teachings of love and mercy from Jesus? Are we supposed to believe that these two drastically different approaches are coming from the same divine source? Some theologians try to explain this away by saying that God's nature didn't change, but humanity's understanding of him did. But that still leaves us with a burning question. Why would a God of love and forgiveness have ever acted like Yahweh did in the Old Testament? Why would he have sanctioned genocide, demanded sacrifices, or punished entire nations? Now, here's where things get wild, the creation stories. On the surface, it seems like a basic origin story, right? What? God creates the heavens, the earth, light, water, classic Bible stuff. But if you look closer, there's a deeper narrative clash between the Old Testament and New Testament creation stories, and it might just change how you see everything. In Genesis, the Old Testament starts with this chaotic mess. The earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, Genesis 1 verse 2. It's a raw, untamed universe, and Yahweh is this force controlling chaos, like a warrior taming wild beasts. There's no peace here, just a battle between order and disorder. Yahweh speaks things into existence, but always with this underlying tension, as if creation itself is a struggle. He separates the waters, subdues the chaos, and forces order into the universe. Contrast that with the New Testament. When we get to John 1 verses 1 to 3, we see a completely different vibe. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Here, creation is not a battle, it's a harmonious act of love and intelligence. The Word, Jesus, creates not through force, but through logos, a divine reason, an intelligent design. There's no chaos to subdue, no monsters lurking in the deep, just a calm, purposeful creation. This sharp contrast between the two stories raises a big question. Are we looking at two different gods creating two different worlds? The Old Testament God's creation is one of conflict. He's constantly fighting against the chaos. But the New Testament gives us a picture of creation through love, wisdom, and peace. How do we reconcile that? For the Gnostics, this was key. They believed Yahweh, the demiurge, created the physical world out of chaos and imperfection. To them, that explained the suffering, pain, and disorder we see all around us. The world was broken from the very start because it was made by a broken God. But Jesus? He represented a higher truth, a connection to the true God who didn't create through conflict, but through pure love and harmony. That's why the Gnostics saw the material world as something to escape from, not embrace. It was flawed, just like its creator. Think about it. If Yahweh's creation was a product of chaos and struggle, doesn't that explain why the Old Testament is filled with violence, punishment, and wrath? And if Jesus' creation is one of harmony, doesn't that explain why his message was one of love, peace, and redemption? We're not just talking about different approaches here. We're talking about two fundamentally different gods, shaping two entirely different realities. The Bible itself gives us these clues. Yahweh's creation starts with darkness, and he has to force light into existence. But in the New Testament, Jesus is light, John 8 verse 12. He doesn't have to fight against the darkness, he overcomes it just by being. So, are these just two perspectives on the same story, or are we dealing with two competing forces? Here's something that's really going to stir things up, the contrast between the laws of Moses and the teachings of Jesus. You've got two figures standing at the center of two very different approaches to God's will. One brings a rigid, unbending law, and the other offers a path of grace and forgiveness. But how do these two fit together? And more importantly, do they really represent the same divine plan? Start with Moses. The guy goes up Mount Sinai, comes down with the 10 Commandments, and kicks off a system of strict laws. We're not just talking about moral guidelines like don't murder or don't steal. No, the law of Moses is a complete, all-encompassing system. It covers everything from what to eat, to how to worship, to how to punish people who break the rules. And the consequences? Brutal. Break the Sabbath? You're stoned to death. Numbers 15:32-36. Touch the Ark of the Covenant when you shouldn't? Instant death. 2 Samuel 6 verses 6-7. There's no room for error here. It's justice, but it's a kind of justice that demands absolute obedience. Fast forward to the New Testament, and Jesus shows up, and suddenly, things look completely different. Where Moses brought rules, Jesus brings something that seems, well, softer. In John 8 verses 3-11, a woman caught in adultery is about to be stoned according to the law of Moses. But Jesus steps in, challenges the crowd, and says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." The crowd disperses, and Jesus tells the woman, "Go now and leave your life of sin." No stoning, no punishment, just grace. Now stop right there. This is more than just a nice moment of forgiveness. This is a direct challenge to the Old Testament law. According to the law of Moses, she should have been executed on the spot. Jesus knew this, and yet he chose a path of mercy. So what's going on here? Is Jesus overturning the law that Yahweh gave to Moses? Or is he revealing something deeper, that the law was never meant to be the final word? This is where things get really interesting for the Gnostics. They believe that the harsh, unforgiving laws of Moses came from Yahweh, the demiurge, a being obsessed with control, punishment, and fear. To them, the law wasn't about leading people to truth. It was about keeping them enslaved to a flawed system. But Jesus, he came to liberate people from that system. In their eyes, Jesus wasn't enforcing Yahweh's law, he was undoing it. He was freeing humanity from the chains of the demiurge's rules. When Jesus says in Matthew 5 verse 17 that he came to fulfill the law, what if he wasn't talking about following it to the letter? What if he was talking about completing it, surpassing it? If Yahweh's law was about fear and punishment, then Jesus' message of grace might be the antidote to everything the Old Testament enforced. The law of Moses demanded blood sacrifices, death penalties, and absolute obedience. Jesus offered forgiveness, healing, and love. And yet, the traditional narrative tries to tell us that these two systems are part of the same divine plan. But how does that make sense? How do you reconcile a God who commands death for breaking the Sabbath with a God who forgives an adulteress without a second thought? This isn't just a theological puzzle, it's a collision of two completely different understandings of divine justice. For the Gnostics, the answer was clear. These were not the same God. Yahweh's law was about power and control, while Jesus' message was about liberation. And the fact that Jesus openly challenged the harshness of the Old Testament law only strengthens the idea that he was offering something radically new, something Yahweh never intended. All right, now we're diving into one of the most intense contrasts between the Old Testament and the New Testament, how God deals with judgment and punishment. In the Old Testament, punishment comes swift and hard. Think about Sodom and Gomorrah. God rains down literal fire and brimstone, wiping out entire cities because of their wickedness. Genesis 19 verses 24-25. It's the kind of terrifying, raw destruction that makes you wonder, is this really the God of mercy and love? But then you turn to the New Testament, and suddenly we're hearing about eternal life, grace, and resurrection. The message is about redemption, not annihilation. Jesus talks about heaven as a reward for the righteous and eternity with God in paradise, Matthew 25 verse 34. It's like we're looking at two completely different approaches to justice. One is about total destruction, the other is about eternal salvation. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still judgment in the New Testament, but it feels different. Instead of fire falling from the sky, we hear Jesus talking about separating the sheep from the goats, Matthew 25 verses 31-46, rewarding the faithful with eternal life and sending the unrighteous into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Yeah, that last part doesn't sound exactly peaceful either, but it's not the same kind of instant obliteration we see with Sodom and Gomorrah. Instead of wiping you off the face of the earth, now there's this concept of eternal punishment. Here's the thing, This shift from immediate catastrophic punishment in the Old Testament to the idea of eternal consequences in the New Testament is huge. In the Old Testament, God's judgment is physical, it's real time. You screw up and boom, fire from heaven, plagues, floods, you name it. But in the New Testament, the punishment is pushed into the afterlife. It's no longer about immediate destruction, it's about what happens after death. Does that mean God's wrath mellowed out over time? Or is it possible that these are two completely different beings with two different goals? Yahweh, the demiurge, dealt in destruction and fear. His punishments were designed to keep humanity in check, to control them through terror. Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood, the plagues in Egypt, these were all about showing his power and keeping people under his rule. But Jesus, he wasn't here to rain down destruction. He was offering a way out, a path to escape the material world and its harsh creator. His talk of eternal life wasn't just about going to heaven, it was about liberation from the flawed creation Yahweh had made. And think about this, while Yahweh is punishing people on earth, Jesus is talking about saving souls, not bodies. He's focused on the spiritual, the eternal. Yahweh's punishments are physical, floods, fire, disease, while Jesus focuses on the afterlife, where the stakes are not about surviving this world, but about where your soul ends up after you die. But here's the twist. Eternal punishment in the New Testament isn't any lighter. Jesus speaks of hell, eternal separation from God, described as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, Matthew 25, verse 30. So is this a softened version of Yahweh's wrath, or is it an entirely new form of judgment? It feels less immediate, sure, but the consequences are still terrifying. Let's talk about one of the most controversial aspects of the Old Testament, Yahweh's obsession with Israel. From the very beginning, the Old Testament makes it crystal clear that Israel is the chosen people. Deuteronomy 7, verse 6 says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God." The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. It's like Yahweh's running a private club, and only one nation gets to wear the exclusive badge of his favor. Throughout the Old Testament, this special relationship between Yahweh and Israel is front and center. He makes covenant after covenant with them, delivers them from Egypt, gives them the promised land, and sends prophet after prophet to keep them in line. But what about the rest of the world? Well, they're pretty much on the outside looking in. Other nations, whether it's the Canaanites, Philistines, or the Amalekites, are often just obstacles in Israel's path, and Yahweh has no problem wiping them out if they get in the way. Now, fast forward to the New Testament, and something massive shifts. Suddenly, God's favor isn't limited to one nation anymore. Jesus bursts onto the scene with a message that's for everyone. In Matthew 28, verse 19, he tells his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations." Notice that? All nations. We've gone from a God who's laser-focused on one group of people to a God who's throwing the doors wide open to the entire world. This isn't just a subtle change, it's a game changer. Is this the same God just evolving with the times, or are we dealing with two very different beings? The Yahweh of the Old Testament doesn't seem all that interested in inclusivity. He's got his people, and everyone else is either ignored, conquered, or destroyed. But Jesus? His sitting with tax collectors, healing Roman soldiers' servants, and preaching to Samaritans, people the Old Testament Yahweh would have written off as enemies. For the Gnostics, this divide made perfect sense. They saw Yahweh as a possessive, controlling God, obsessed with keeping Israel as his special project, while ignoring the rest of humanity. In their view, Yahweh was a lesser deity, trapped in a limited understanding of what divinity should be. Jesus, on the other hand, represented the true God, a higher, universal force whose message was meant to free everyone, not just a select few. For the Gnostics, Jesus came to break down the walls that Yahweh had built, offering salvation to anyone who would listen, regardless of their nationality or background. Look at Paul's letters in the New Testament. He's constantly hammering home this idea that in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus, Galatians 3 verse 28. That's a radical departure from the Old Testament, where the distinctions between Jew and Gentile were everything. And think about how that would have landed in a first-century Jewish context. If you'd grown up hearing that your nation was Yahweh's chosen, his beloved, the people with the special covenant. And now here's this guy, Paul, saying, nope, everyone's included now. That would have been mind-blowing. Offensive even. It's no wonder there was so much conflict in the early church about whether Gentiles could be part of the Christian movement without following the old Jewish laws. We've covered a lot of ground here, but now we've come to the final, and probably the most significant difference between the Old Testament and New Testament, the death of Jesus. In the Old Testament, the idea of sacrifice was brutal and bloody. You sin, you offer up an animal, blood is spilled, and somehow that makes things right again. Yahweh's system of justice demanded it. The law was clear: sin equals death, and there's a price that has to be paid. But then, in the New Testament, everything changes. Jesus becomes the ultimate sacrifice, once and for all, for everyone. No more bulls or goats, no more altars dripping with blood. Just one man, one moment, and suddenly the entire system is flipped on its head. Hebrews 9 verse 12 tells us that Jesus entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. Now, at first glance, this seems like a beautiful, redemptive story, right? Jesus dies to save humanity from sin. But what if it's more than that? What if the death of Jesus wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about liberation? The Gnostics believed that Jesus' death was a lot more than just the fulfillment of Yahweh's system of sacrifices. To them, Jesus didn't die to satisfy Yahweh's wrath, he died to free us from Yahweh's flawed creation. They saw the material world as broken, corrupt, and imperfect, a direct result of the demiurge, Yahweh's imperfect design. Jesus' death wasn't about making peace with Yahweh, it was about opening the door to something higher, something better. He was the key to escaping the trap of this material world, a world created not by a perfect God, but by a being who was far from perfect. In the Old Testament, sacrifice is about paying for sins committed in a flawed world. But in the New Testament, Jesus' sacrifice isn't just a transaction, it's a cosmic jailbreak. His death tears the veil of the temple, Matthew 27 verse 51, literally breaking the barrier between God and humanity. The Gnostics believed that Jesus came not to redeem the material world, but to show us that there's something beyond it, something beyond the flawed creation of the demiurge. And here's the kicker: Jesus didn't stay dead. His resurrection isn't just a symbol of life after death. It's a sign that the material world, with all its flaws, doesn't have the final say. The resurrection is Jesus' ultimate victory over Yahweh's flawed creation. The demiurge couldn't hold him down, and by rising from the dead, Jesus shows that we too are meant for something beyond this broken world. His resurrection was the final nail in the coffin for Yahweh's system of sacrifice and punishment. So what does this all mean? Are we looking at one God with a complex plan, or two radically different beings with competing visions for humanity? On one hand, Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, seems obsessed with control, sacrifice, and punishment. On the other hand, Jesus represents freedom, grace, and a call to something beyond the material world. The contrast couldn't be clearer. If you've stuck with us through this deep dive into the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God, we've covered a lot of territory: chaos versus love, law versus grace, and destruction versus salvation. There's so much to unpack, and we hope it's left you with more questions than answers, because that's how real learning begins. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this discussion or have your own thoughts, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone who loves digging deep into these big questions. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to explore more with you. God bless us all.